Hello, everybody. Welcome to the third episode of the McGill AI podcast. My name is Cole, and I'm here with Himanshu. We are tremendously excited to have Professor Guillaume Lajoie joining us today. Guillaume is an assistant professor at Université de Montréal, Canada's CIFAR AI Chair, core academic member at Mila, a research scholar at FRQS, and has research center affiliations with Unique, CIRCA, and CRM.
So today we're going to be talking about a variety of things, Professor. Your research interests, and more specifically, how neuroscience has inspired AI, how AI influences neuroscience, brain-computer interfaces, and of course, the ethical aspects of that research and advice for students looking to get into the field. Why don't we start out with a little bit about your background? Can you tell us about your journey into academia?
All right, like straight off the bat in the deep waters. So yeah, thank you very much. I'm super pleased to be on this podcast. I think this is a great initiative. And all right, let's think about this here. What inspired me to get into academia? So early on in my background, I almost went and did an undergrad degree in philosophy. And so I was really interested in, questions about, the human mind and how deep questions, let's just say. And then I remember seeing some documentary about mathematics and proofs and how, and the formal nature of them seemed like a good actionable tool set to to have on top of these big questions that I was motivated by. And so I decided to do an undergrad degree in mathematics, and that's kind of what got me started. And then why I stayed in academia, there was certainly a period where it's just, I was fortunate to, do internships with some professors and do some research internships, and then that led into a master's degree, and then which led into a PhD later on. And so it was very much for the love of research that kept me in academia. And to be fair, it was I was lucky enough to have the opportunities to stick around and have a research support system that enabled me to do this. So that's kind of motivated by big questions, and I stayed because I was doing well, and the questions were still interesting and becoming more and more interesting.
Yeah, that's super cool. I didn't know that you were considering doing philosophy at one point. I'm curious, did that ever play into the path you did choose to take? Did you ever end up taking some philosophy classes, or is
yes and no. I think, I've already, I was interested in reading a lot of books back in high schools and so on, but I think, I did a little bit of a foray in my undergraduate degree into pure mathematics, which was kind of really interesting, and then quickly went towards more applied mathematics, where I think these very sophisticated tools that are human built in some sense were being applied to ask questions about the natural world. And I think that process, coming from something that's inherently human, like built up on systems of axioms and so on, and then applied them to like big mysteries of science and of nature, right? Like understanding how stuff works was really appealing to me. And then later on, like full circle, I got interested in the brain and applying these tools to arguably one of the most complex systems in the universe, which incidentally supports all these big questions that have been motivating me early on. So it's kind of like a full circle in that respect. So I guess you could say that it's all related, right?
It's really interesting to see how all of your research interests and subject interests sort of came together at the end, where you're now working in AI, mathematics, and philosophy all a little bit.
Hindsight is 2020, and maybe it's a professional a trait. That's how you write grants in general. It all connects, right? So, but it really does at this point, I think. Yeah.
That's very interesting. So moving on, Professor, Broadly, what exactly does your research focus on, and how do you go about finding problems and research topics?
Okay, that's a good question. So I would say my research program has two main axes, right? So my background, again, is in mathematics. I have my PhD is in applied mathematics, and it's been mostly applied to problems of dynamics, right? So I'm interested in the dynamics of neural networks, both artificial and biological. And so what I say the main theme of my research is this idea of driven neural networks, and understanding the principles of how computations can be supported by neural network dynamics. Now, that being said, I've always been, again, interested about how the brain works and then how to build these systems from scratch on the AI side of things. And my current research program is very much, still aligned with these two questions. One, I would say, one axis is fairly theoretical. So again, developing mathematical tools and to better understand how networks learn and how computations is supported in them. And again, I think there's common questions here for both artificial systems and biological systems that can lead to a better understanding of both. And that's usually the type of questions that I'm interested in. And then the second axis is a little bit more applied, and it's kind of linking these two interests, and that's developing theory and tools for brain-computer interfacing, right? So the way, like, how can we directly interact with the nervous system? I think, and the main motivation here for me is the scientific tool that provides, right? So big questions surrounding how the brain works right now, I think, are better framed or like efforts about understanding how the brain works should be spent around learning, right? How the brain shapes its computations, its architecture, its anatomy to lead ways to function. And I think a really important scientific tool to probe these questions is to directly interface with the brain using implants and such devices. So without going too much into details, I think that's an important scientific endeavor to develop these technologies. And on top of that, it has tremendous sort of therapeutic effects, right? So there's anywhere from neuromodulations for recovery after injury to enabling people with severe motor dysfunctions to control robotic systems or outside systems with their minds to facilitate their lives. So there's a lot of promise into deploying these technologies in both science and medical applications, which I think is super rewarding. And just to close there, the big challenges are novel and unique with respect to the machine learning and AI demands, right? So the systems are super noisy. They change all the time because there's ongoing plasticity in the brain. Data is expensive, right? Like you can't go and like probe as much as you want in the brain. And so there's these unique challenges that force us to think differently in terms of the algorithms used for brain-computer interfacing, which I think is super rewarding as well. So sorry for the lengthy answer, but those are the questions that interest me in my research program.
No, that was awesome. Thanks for elaborating on all those different points. It was cool. When I think of brain-computer interfaces, I normally mainly think about the medical applications and things like that. But it's cool to hear your perspective that it's also super useful for helping learn more about the brain. And being able to interact in that way.
So a little bit more on that. The reason I say this, and it's not cryptic at all, right? Like if you think about ways people do experiments in systems neuroscience and behavioral neuroscience, a lot of time you either look at behavior in humans or you train animals to do some sort of task, and then you ask about what type of computations might correlate with these tasks, either by recording from neurons or imaging from neurons or what have you. But we can't record from the whole brain yet, right? Like, so we always have a subsample of the neurons or the neural circuits that are involved in some tasks, and we can do a lot in drawing parallels and measuring correlations between behavior and these activities. But there's always the unobserved part, which we have to abstract away. There's some confounders. Like we can never be sure about the sort of causal pathway between some behavior, or rather between sort of neural activity and the behavior that comes out. With neural interfaces, I think you can remove at least some of that, right? Because say you're in a situation where an animal or a human controls, say, a cursor on the screen with a neural implant. So the activity of neurons that you're recording are directly controlling and exclusively controlling the tasks you have, right? So you have a lot more control on the actual pipeline, in the sense that the neurons you're reading out from and that are controlling an external device are the ones that are implementing this. There's no other stuff that you're not recording from. And so that gives a unique window into at least that readout mechanism, right? That you don't need to have confounders or think about these types of other mechanisms. Of course, the whole brain is doing some stuff to enable that readout to work, right? And I'm not abstracting that. But just removing that sort of correlation and replacing it with causation at that readout point gives tremendous advantages to probe really important questions of learning. So anyway, closing parentheses, this is why I think it's an interesting scientific tool. Yeah.
That's really awesome, Professor. It was very interesting to hear about the differences between like how brain neural interfaces. Did I say that right?
Yeah,
Brain? Yeah,
there's
okay.
a few words. It's like you can use BCI for brain computer interface, BMI for brain machine interface, neural interfacing, like neural implants. There's a zoo of terms out there, but
Okay, I'm glad. Yeah, it's really cool to hear about that stuff, because I feel like I just did not know about this, and or like that this existed to this extent already. So it's really fascinating. But also, Professor, just to clarify a little bit for our listeners, what exactly are dynamical systems? Because you spoke a little bit about that before and about how that's involved in your research today.
Yeah.
But just what exactly are they?
Okay, that's a good question. So dynamical systems are actually, it's a subfield of mathematics that studies systems that evolve in time. So that's a very general statement. So it's a very interesting sort of discipline that can be traced back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, primarily sort of developed to understand celestial dynamics, right? So we've all heard about the three-body problem, right? Like how to predict the motion of three bodies that are subject to gravitational forces is a very hard one. And so that can be traced back to the origins of dynamical system, which is essentially the study of systems that evolve in time. So a lot of time, if you've heard of, say, ordinary differential equations, or even like difference equations, so stuff that you iterate in a discrete time step, these are examples of dynamical systems, right? So when you solve a differential equation, ordinary differential equation, and say your free variable, label it as time, what you're essentially given is an equation that gives you the derivative of the motion of a certain object in time, or the evolution of a certain object, or its attributes in time, and the solution of that equation are trajectories, right, of that system. And so dynamical system, beyond just thinking about solving differential equation, thinks about the whole state space of all possible solutions at once, and studies how this behaves on a global timescale. So do you have sort of attracting states? Do you have periodic motion? A sub branch of dynamical systems, you might have heard of the term like chaos or chaos theory. This is very much a product of the field of dynamical systems, to understand these systems that have deterministic evolution rules, right? So there's not necessarily noise or stochasticity, but that can lead to very unpredictable dynamics and complex activity on weird sort of like geometric surfaces. This is very much like understanding these types of situations and that arise in fluid dynamics and turbulent flow, and nowadays in many other applications, such as neural circuits in the brain. So this theory was developed under the guise of dynamical systems. So again, a very interesting, in my opinion, branch of mathematics, and really worth pursuing, I think.
Yeah, that's awesome, and it's good context to know. And I guess you would say it's very core to like brain-computer interface research, or does it appear a lot in those areas?
Yeah, I'd say tools of dynamical systems are prevalent and amenable to many different fields. Like anything that has some sort of dynamics, and you try to understand the sort of long-term behavior or stable behavior of systems, uses in some sense tools from dynamical systems theory. So that's not surprising that it's useful in the context of computational neuroscience and neural interfacing, but also in the context of artificial intelligence, right? Like a lot of stability proof for optimizations of neural networks, for example, or just neural networks themselves. If you have recurrent neural networks, these are dynamical systems, and the proofs of stability of convergence rely heavily on tools from dynamical systems theory. So I think it's a little bit peppered everywhere, right? Like you need these types of tools to study big networks, essentially.
Yeah, that's a nice word, pepper, to describe.
Yeah.
Sweet. Yeah. So maybe talking a little bit more about brain-computer interfaces. So you mentioned you started with math, then you got more interested in the brain, and then I guess you landed more into brain-computer interfaces. How has your sort of focus within brain-computer interfaces changed over time, or like how long have you been involved more specifically with that area of research?
Yeah, that's a good question. So to be clear, right, like I'm a mathematician, and I work on a number of different things, and currently there's a lot of projects, and my interests are centered on questions related to brain-computer interfaces. But I'm not necessarily, like an end-to-end expert on brain-computer interfacing. I just want to preface this. I just think it's a really promising field, and we should pay attention a lot more. And I think development of theory and AI tools to address challenges in BMIs and is super important. Now, that being said, I think a lot of the questions early on for brain-computer interfacing has been of an engineering kind, right? So how do you design devices that can reliably record or stimulate or just interface with the nervous system, right? Like that's not a small feat, right? Like there's different ways you can do it, either in a non-invasive or in an invasive way. So basically stuff that does not go inside your body or stuff that goes inside your body. Obviously, there's kind of signal resolution questions, stuff that doesn't go in your body, such as EEG, like think about the helmets that you can see and put on your brain. These are great because they're non-invasive, but the signals are pretty noisy, and it's hard to do something meaningful with these signals, although there's a lot of progress in that field. But really invasive devices are where I think there's a lot of potentials for meaningful interactions with the nervous system. And that has important engineering challenges, right? Like you need to implant working devices inside the brain, which is no small feat. So I would say now we're getting to a point where the hardware has enough channels, enough throughput, is reliable enough, and as we understand enough about the physiology that surrounds the interfacing, that it's becoming to be something that's quite powerful, right? So, for example, there's been proof of concepts recently that humans can type words pretty much as fast as one can do on a keyboard using an implanted brain-computer interface, stuff like that. So I would say that in the past decades, the development of the hardware has been at the forefront, and it still is, right? Like I don't want to say that it's solved. Think about, for example, Neuralink, which is a startup that's in the news that's been developing like really high throughput hardware. But more and more, as we get these reliable hardware, I think the big fundamental questions about the software is becoming more and more to the front, right? So it's one thing to demonstrate with a proof of concept that you can read out from a few neurons to control low degree of freedom tasks, such as whatever, playing Pong, or controlling a cursor on the screen, which is 2 degrees of freedom. But really, if you want to scale interfacing to many more degrees of freedom, right? Controlling whatever, like a robotic arm with many degrees of freedom and so on. I think there's really a lot of challenges in understanding how the brain learns in concert with a readout or artificial system that learns at the same time. So I think the really interesting emerging question that's amenable because this brought forth because of the development of hardware is questions about like co-learning between the machines and the brain. And this is where I think there's exciting progress to be made, right? Like how do we design decoders to coax the brain into learning representations to interact with these devices that are robust and scalable, right? And so there's questions about biology, there's questions about theory of learning in terms of like, we still don't understand exactly how deep networks learn, and we have access to all of their parameters and all their activities. So like meshing these fields, right? Like thinking about the theory of learning and theory and how it's implemented in the brain, I think is super exciting. And these are the types of questions that are becoming more and more at the forefront of brain-computer interfacing.
It's very interesting how you say, Professor, that the brain and the concept of co-learning in itself is so fascinating to me, because I feel like so far in the field of artificial intelligence, we've had different algorithms that have been inspired by the brain, right?
Yeah.
But now that's changing a little bit. So I was curious to know or learn a little bit about how biology or physiology, how artificial intelligence has affected biology and physiology. So the other way around.
So that's a very interesting question. So again, so taking a little bit a step away from just the pure brain-computer interface question, I think you presented it quite well in the sense that early day AI, and by AI, let's just say like early day neural networks destined to work on AI, have been heavily inspired by how the brain works, right? Basically connect a bunch of small threshold units or transfer units, right? And make them implement really complex stuff, essentially. And now, well, there's a few different ways to answer your question about how, closing the loop, right? Like what AI can tell us about how the brain works. The obvious answer is, one of the obvious ways is because of the ML tool that they implement, right? Like deep networks are great at learning complex functions and uncovering sort of like unseen structure in data, for example. So, and this is kind of the obvious way, like the developments of machine learning techniques to better understand the big amount of data that we get out of neuroscience experiment is one way that loop is closed. But beyond that, I think what we're starting to see in the computational neuroscience community, and by starting in the past 5 years, I'd say, is the more prevalent use of deep learning architectures and ways to train models to essentially mimic task or behavior of animals, and then looking at the emergent principles that are learned, right, from an end-to-end perspective, right? So you train an artificial network to perform the same behavioral task as a mouse, for example. And what people are starting to see is that oftentimes you'll get some neuroscience kind of system or mechanism that emerges from learning that task, right? In some sense, it's very different from previous modeling efforts. Usually when you think about computational modeling, you think about, bottom-up type of approaches, in the sense that you understand some mechanisms of the physiology, you try to implement them as simply and as tractably as possible in a model, you put them together and you show that they lead to function that's more emergent, like that's the bigger than the sum of the parts, for example. But I think deep learning approaches are more top down, right? Like, let's start from the actual computation that's being done. Let's have as much of a blank slate as possible, but still connecting with the biologies. Namely, there's some networks and some neurons in the network. But let's learn these tasks from an end-to-end standpoint. So, and then you get to a point where you can observe and ask questions about the origin of some of these biological mechanisms, just based on the fact that they seem to be invariant to many, biological details, right? A good example of this is work from the DiCarlo lab a few years back, where essentially they showed that they can predict the activity of neurons in the visual cortex to a degree that was never seen before by training like artificial neural networks on the same perceptual tasks as the animals they were recording neurons from. So now the onus was not on fitting and predicting the activity of single neurons, it was on doing the task. But it turns out that a byproduct of this is to fit the activity of individual neurons, even if that was not the goal to begin with, right? So I think this tool of that allows kind of in silico brain evolution and leading to these sort of emergent discoveries that some of these biological principles are indeed emerging in very simple settings is super exciting, right? So sorry for the lengthy answer, but that's one way that I think there's fundamental return from AI to neuroscience, is these novel modeling techniques.
Yeah, that's sweet with and the mice and
Yeah.
but yes, circling back a little bit to I was just interested. I sort of got captured by when you mentioned co-learning between like a brain-computer interface implanted device, Neuralink, and a human brain. What does that look like? It's sort of the human brain learning how to interact and understand the co-learning device or the implanted device.
Well, so let's take an example, right? A lot of times, how does like an implant work? Say you're implanting a device in the motor cortex of an individual, and that you're asking that individual to control a cursor on a screen. Okay, that's the kind of typical experiment. So essentially, say you can record from a few neurons. Typically, people implant in motor cortex because these are the areas of the brain that are used to kind of volitionally control kind of complex activity. Basically, they're the neurons that project to the spinal cord, that project to your muscles. So these are the neurons that essentially have the controls for your limbs and the way you move your body. So typically, an implant is going to be targeting these neurons. Now, these neurons usually are used to control your body in other ways, right? So they might be tuned to certain movement. So they might be active if you move your hands towards, upper right, for example. So now the idea is, if you identify some of these neurons that are tuned to motion, you can actually piggyback them. You can hijack them and say, okay, now I'm going to listen to these neurons, and every time this neuron is active, I'm going to make the cursor move to the upper right, for example, right? So the way that that's done is typically with decoders, right? Decoders that learn the tuning properties of the neurons you're essentially connected to. Now, down the line, it turns out that it's not a one-to-one correspondence, right? It's not that there's just one neuron that controls you, like a certain muscle in your arm, and it's not if you're hijacking that activity of one neuron that there's necessarily like a catastrophic interference with when you move your arm. What happens is that you learn to control these brain-computer interfaces, and the tuning of these neurons is going to change, right? You're essentially they might not be as tuned for the motor output that they were tuned for before. They're becoming more tuned to essentially this new limb that you have, which is an external control device. But the way this process happens, right, like how this tuning changes over time, has to do with learning properties of the brain, right? It's the same way when you learn a new sport, you're learning to, the first time you try tennis, for example, right? Like you're trying to swing a racket and pretty bad at it, but you see that you're missing the ball because you're too low or too high. Like there's some error signals that essentially enable your brain to learn these motions better and better and better. And it's the same thing that happens when you have a BCI device that's controlled with the brain. The question is, the decoders that we use to select which neurons and which attribution which degrees of freedom to attribute them to is also learning, right? So how do you kind of align these two mechanisms such that the representations you learn, the tuning of the neurons you learn, are scalable and robust and are not necessarily like amenable to noise? And so these are the questions of co-learning I was alluding to. So I hope that's a little bit clearer. Like, let me know if you have questions.
Yeah. I really like that connection to like a limb, like the idea of you sort of put the brain-computer interface in and it's kind of like a new limb. Like sometimes, I try and imagine what it would be like to have a tail. And it's like I don't know how I would control a tail, but I guess somehow your brain just learns how, do this thing and the tail moves in this way and you kind of just figure it out.
And actually, it's funny enough, like if you think from the evolutionary perspective, right? Some of the machinery in motor control is shared across a wide range of species, right? And basically, evolution does not reinvent the wheel whenever you have a different kind of sensory or motor apparatus. Like you're talking about a tail, or like the sensory system is very similar in terms of how cortical dynamics work. But you don't reinvent circuits anytime you have a different sense. Like we don't have whiskers, but essentially the motor cortices of rats or mice are very similar to ours. So in a sense, it's not surprising that you can plug in something and that the brain can learn, because the brain has evolved into these pretty much natural solutions such that you have kind of a plug and play type of system, right? Like you have these circuits, they're amenable to learning. They can interface with different sensory and motor output across species, right? So in a sense, you're not doing something terribly different by plugging into sort of an external device and asking to control it as a limb, right? Or at least that's the principle that seems to be emerging from these early days of BMI research, right? So the learning part is surprisingly robust and works well, right? The question is, let's try to do something that's a little bit less dumb than before, and try to make sure that we can scale it in a meaningful way.
Not gonna lie, Professor, everything we've spoken about so far, especially in the last couple of minutes, has seemed very futuristic sci-fi to me. So to like ground ourselves back and sort of demystify this whole field, I'm curious about where exactly we are right now when it comes to brain-computer interfaces. Like what is possible for us to do, and what do you think the timeline looks like for the next 10, 15, 20 years maybe, and where we're going to end up in that much time?
Okay, so again, I'm just going to reiterate that I'm not necessarily like an end-to-end expert on brain-computer interfaces. I'm interested in artificial intelligence at large, and I think these are problems that are not only ripe for important breakthroughs in machine learning, but also can inform machine learning by virtue of their scientific impact on neuroscience. Now, with that being said, I think what's clear is that there's hardware that's been developed with a lot more channel count, and so the throughput, the bandwidth, is going to get a lot higher. I think what's also clear is that there's a lot of activity in terms of developing sort of clinical applications. Obviously, that's the main driver. But what's been new in the past couple of years is that there's a lot of startups that are popping up. There's a lot of key players that are moving this from the academic lab to the sort of industry, and so I think there's going to be an acceleration of the end products that you see. It's still going to be sort of experimental stuff for the foreseeable future, I think, especially the invasive stuff. The non-invasive stuff, you start to see products, right, like that use EEG to improve usefulness of devices or your concentration or whatever, right? But invasive stuff is going to get into the clinic more and more. It's already there, right? Like if you think about deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's, for example, or cochlear implants, there's thousands and hundreds of thousands of people that have neural implants and live with them in the world. But more and more, I think you'll see these things for a variety of conditions, right? So there's evidence that interacting with the nervous system can replace pharmaceutical treatments and complement them in some cases. So instead of like flooding the body with pharmaceutical compounds to target like really specific stuff, but you have all these byproducts, sometimes I think it is simpler to interact with the nervous system and in very targeted ways. And so I think these types of therapeutic use cases are going to be popping up, right, in the near future. Now, in the case of implants as prosthetics, right, like so for people that might be quadriplegic, for example, and need to control sort of a cursor or external apparatus with their brains, that's also going to come online a little bit more. I think what's a little bit more down the line and still science fiction is the sort of augmented cognition type of angle, which I think scares a lot of people, and rightfully so, right? Like we don't want necessarily to have a society where there's like people that are augmented cognitively and some others that are not. I think that's a further down the line, and that doesn't mean that there's no ethical questions about like developing the technology. I think there is, but practically speaking, I think important progress that we'll witness in the coming years are from the clinical aspect of things.
That makes sense. So starting with clinical, then moving maybe eventually towards augmentation, but we'll see. It's already crazy. You mentioned that with implants, people are typing at almost the same speed that they can type on a keyboard. That already seems pretty crazy. And with the whole Facebook Meta announcement, we'll see.
That's another story. But
what's going to happen? But so we saw you've done research relating to artificial rewiring of the brain. Could you elaborate on that? Is that similar to co-learning, or what is the idea?
So again, so that's similar in some way, right? So a lot of these therapeutic mechanisms of interfacing with the brain are usually targeting some plasticity mechanisms, namely like basically rewiring networks, right? So say you have a stroke and you lose part of the motion in your arm, for example, because some of the neurons in your motor cortex are dead due to the stroke. There's almost all the time other types like healthy neurons that are residual, that have either residual connections or weaker connections that can control your arm. And that's why physiotherapy and a lot of like rehabilitation is focusing on recruiting these networks and reinforcing them, and basically promoting plasticity to rewire parts of your brain to be reused for other basically to pick up where some dead neurons might have left you off. And so the question here is there a way to improve and reinforce this principle with neural interfacing? And it's been shown in this seminal papers from I think 2007 or 2008 from the FETS lab that you could have a bidirectional device that kind of listens to some neurons and stimulate others in an order to essentially hack into a principle of plasticity that's called spike dependent plasticity, spike time dependent plasticity, STDP. And that what that principle does is in your brain, whenever there's a neuron that's weakly or connected to another neuron, if there's a spike from the presynaptic neuron that precedes a spike from a postsynaptic neuron, some of the neurons essentially are going to potentiate their synapse. In other words, the synapse, the connection between the two neurons is going to get stronger. And we believe that that's because there's some evidence of causal relationship. If there's, statistically speaking, more spiking that precedes the other spiking, then you're going to reinforce the connection between the two. And the idea behind that particular paper was to say, okay, maybe we can hack into this artificially. So the idea is that there's a device that listens to some recorded site. Whenever there's activity in that site, you stimulate another site artificially within a delay that's consistent with STDP. And it was shown that you can actually promote and strengthen synapses or connections between these neural sites using this procedure. And then my contribution there was, we built a model to predict the changes that can be done at scale and to help optimize these types of procedures, right? So I think these types of results showcase how neural interfacing can be targeted to influence precise neural circuits for recovery purposes, and that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, that's super exciting. Is that used like clinically today, or is that still a work in progress?
It's under development, right? So similar principles are in clinical trials today. There's a lot of activity here in Montreal and my collaborators' labs where we are, at the point where we're asking about how to optimize these types of procedures, right? So I would say 10 years ago was the proof of concept that can be done. Now it's not precisely exactly the same way. It's not like this, paired pulse stimulation that's all the time. Sometimes you can just do is stimulate the brain to evoke precise complex movements, and that's enough to strengthen the pathways of that generate these movements. And we're at the point where we're asking how to optimize these types of procedures. So I think, and there's a couple of companies that are getting launched to actually aim at doing this and deploy them as therapies. And so I'd say it's still under development, but it's getting closer to being used for real. Yeah. It's not an easy problem to fix, right? Like the brain is noisy and like there's all kinds of challenges, but progress is being done.
It's still completely unbelievable how far we've gotten. Still, when we seem to know, we're still sort of poking around in the dark sometimes, but very inspiring. Maybe moving to some more ethical questions. Is there what sort of ethical considerations do you take into account for your research? Maybe specifically, does that come up often for you, or what does that look like?
No, that's a really good question. I have to say that off the bat, of course, that line of research involves collaboration with labs that do some animal experiments. But I have to say that the ethical considerations there are very serious, and not the considerations themselves. Of course, they're serious, but the ethical design experiments and the conduct and the is very well established, right? So anytime you design these types of experiments, there's ethical protocols. It has to go in front of a committee and a board that decides whether or not it adheres to some guidelines about ethics. So first of all, in terms of experiments, there's a lot of ethical infrastructure that surrounds the design of these experiments, which I think is super important. And second, I guess where that question was going is, what are the sort of potential use cases and ethical questions that come out of deployment of these devices? And there are many, right? And I think this is a super important question to ask, right? So for example, if a person relies on a device in their brain to function, right? And the treatment or the signals of that device delivers can alter some of their personality, right? Like can affect their judgment, can affect their decision making. So where do you draw the line, right? Where's personal responsibility versus where's the device's fault? That's a very thorny question. And fortunately, there's medical ethicians that are building a thought like systems to ask these questions and to answer them. I think it's a super important field to keep in mind. I don't want to get into necessarily the details here because I'm not an expert, but I'm learning fast around it. I think it's super important. And to the point where it's something that we're putting together right now where I'd like to have some ethics focused student or collaborations with ethicists that are embedded in some of the research projects that we do, right? To ask these questions in advance and really to think about this before it gets to the point where the question is out in the world, right? And so, not the question, I mean the product, right? Like where you realize that there might be a problem when you deploy this. So, I would say I don't have answers to these questions necessarily, but I think I'm really attuned, and I think they're important, and I think it's important to have some of the resources that are earmarked for these types of questions. So yeah, moving forward, I can tell you a bit more about this in the coming couple years. Let's hope.
I found, so Professor, you mentioned how the power that these Neuralink, for example, or other neural implants or brain computer interfaces have is sometimes scary because, if you have a device externally that is interacting with your brain, it can make differences. So what I'm wondering in this situation is, how do we understand when some form of research is getting too risky, in the sense that for example, there's obviously a lot of great uses for brain computer interfaces, right? But at the same time, it can also be used extremely negatively if it gets as powerful as we think it is. So how do we, understand when we need to stop or put in place ways to potentially curb the negative impacts from coming through, in your opinion, of course?
I mean, that's an important question and a huge one. And I think it's a general question for sort of technology at large, right? Like, I think the same question can be asked, could have been asked for a lot of other technologies that might use or have been used for nefarious goals. I don't exactly know when is I guess, like from a research project perspective, if your objectives are clear and you ask yourself, like they pass ethical concerns, I think that's the first step, right? Like if you're developing a tool to, that infringes on personal privacy, for example, like to give an example of other uses of AI these days, right? That's an ethical concern, right? Like the same way development of whatever, like aerodynamics have been used to create missiles, right? Like that's like, there's some of these cases that are not necessarily avoidable from the research perspective, but there's little steps that can be done in your own research. And I guess it comes back to sort of the cost benefit, right? Or the of developing technology at large, right? Which is a thorny question. Of course, like there's these nefarious use cases that we need to think about. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of advances and advantages of advancing the technology for good, right? and I think it's a difficult thing to navigate, and it's an important thing that I think researchers should ask themselves about the potential impact of their research, but we shouldn't stop ourselves innovating because of the potential pitfalls, right? So, for example, there's been a change at the way. So there's the main AI and kind of computational theoretical neuroscience conference called NeurIPS, happens every year, and that's kind of like the top shelf AI conference, right? And recently they've added a requirement such that every paper that goes into that's submitted to NeurIPS must have a section that discusses the potential impact of the results. And I think that's great. It might be more relevant to some applications than others, right? Like if you write a super theoretical paper, it might be hard to think about the potential good and bad impact on society if you prove theorems. But it does force authors to think about this, right? Like it shifts the mindset from academia to having, developing things that have a real world impact. And these are the small steps that I think are super important to take at that point. Of course, they don't solve the whole problem of potentially really bad use of this technology. But I think it's better than having a Wild West where these questions are ignored and shrugged under the rug. So,
yeah, that's really cool that they have that idea for requiring sort of a consideration of the effects. And like you said, I guess it is sort of everything that can be used for good can sort of be used for bad. So it's a tricky cost benefit analysis.
And I will add that there's some agency that can be constructed at the researcher's level, which I think is well supported. For example, I'm just going to take the example of Mila here, where I'm sitting at. This is one of the biggest academic research centers for deep learning. And in Mila's core mission, there is basically developing AI for good, right? Ethical considerations are front and center. There's a lot of this discussion in Montreal, and actually Montreal is arguably one of the leading places where these types of considerations are being discussed at large for the uses of AI. And I think that's paramount, super important that leaders in the academic field talk about these things openly, right?
Yeah, that's awesome that Mila takes that approach. I guess, yes, so starting to wrap up here, maybe just some general, if you have advice for any students looking to enter AI or sort of brain-computer interface type research, or even just any general life advice, or I don't know. Yeah, Himanshu wants to.
Wait, I actually have another question.
Okay.
So we spoke a lot about, sorry about that. We spoke a lot about
we'll
the ethics of all of the technology that we've spoken about today.
Yeah.
What I'm curious about now is that everything you've said so far is that we have to take a lot of small steps to curb all of the negative impacts of our research happening. I have two questions about that. One, is our society ready or equipped to actually understand the impact that this technology can have to take the steps to prevent it from happening? And furthermore, two, what are the socio-political impacts that you believe brain-computer interfaces can have? I know these are really tough questions, but I'm really curious about them.
These are tough questions. Do I believe society is ready for these changes? Well, if you think about big technological advancement, there's always been disrupting factors, but there's always also been kind of good net benefit, right? Think about industrial revolution and the emergence of the internet. Of course, there's been some feathers ruffled along the way, but overall, I think we can say we're better off than we were 100 years ago, right? So I think the same is true here. It's not like it's brain interfacing. Yes, is a technology that's captures our imaginary in kind of unique ways because it interfaces with what makes us in a certain sense. But in other sense, it's not that dissimilar to other sort of technological revolution. And I must say that it's not at a point where it's a revolution quite yet, right? Like this, of course, we might get there, right? But there's a lot of road ahead. So I think from a general basis, I'm not that worried about society accepting new technology, right? Of course, we understand, we've learned from mistakes from the past as well. There's some challenges there, but for me, developing knowledge and understanding the world we live in and interacting with the world we live in more meaningful ways is well worth the disrupting factors of developing technology. So that's one. And what was your other question? Sorry, like, so is society ready? Sure. And then what's the other one again? Sorry.
The other question was, what is the societal and political impact? Like, how is society going to change once this research goes out there and large?
Yeah, okay. So again, it's not, I don't know, right? Like everything, I think introduction of that particular technology is going to be incremental, right? You might like, and this is highly speculative, like, but the way I'm seeing it go down is that it's going to make its way through a lot of clinical applications. It's going to become more and more acceptable and part of almost routine to have neural interfacing interactions or interventions for medical purposes, and then who knows, maybe use cases with beyond medicine might emerge, but I don't think it's going to be like tomorrow there's like a few elites that have chips in their brains and we're going to be controlling everybody else. Like that's not going to happen. Like it's way more gradual than that. And so I think thinking about the sort of like catastrophic science fiction type of scenarios, yes, it can give us a nice worst case scenario type of perspective to think about things not to do. But I think the gradual nature of how this technology, it's slow progress, right? How this technology develops is kind of mitigates the fact of whether or not the society is ready. Society is going to becomes slowly accustomed to it, is my guess.
Yeah, that makes sense. That answers the question really well, actually. Thank you.
Okay. And then to come back to the other question about like advice for students, right? So I would say do math. Math, physics, like important, like you'd be surprised at how much of really influential machinery from theoretical physics, from statistical physics, from dynamical systems, applied mathematics, the tools that have been developed in these so-called like kind of pure disciplines or like foundational disciplines, we use this every day, right? So I think it's important to be attuned to new and emerging fields and exciting fields such as AI, and you definitely need to keep up with the progress. But as an undergraduate student, as like an early career graduate student, it's paramount that you at least are aware and master to a certain extent really established sort of core principles of science, right? And that goes through physics, mathematics, computer science. Now I put that in that basket, right? So I would be wary, and there's both sides to the medal, and I don't want to make a categorical statement here, but I wouldn't worry about specializing too early. If you want to be part of research in a field, of course you need to be involved in some research program, projects and so on, but just like shaping your program early on to just be specialized into AI or something like that is not going to help you to think outside the box and develop AI, right? For example. So, know your statistical physics, know your mathematics, know like your probability theory. These core tools come out all the time. And if you want to be at the forefront, you need to master these, right? So That's
As
my
much as I,
advice.
yeah, as much as I agree with you, Professor, like I am reminded day in, day out that I need to have a strong foundation to be doing like the courses I'm taking right now in my fourth
Yeah.
year of university.
Yeah.
But with you saying maybe, take it a little slower and don't initially specialize, I feel like the industry is moving so fast today that if you don't start specializing by your second, third year of undergraduate, you almost feel like you're left behind. Because I felt that way when I was in my second, third year. So
That's a
how do
good
we
point.
sort of balance that out with,
Yeah.
strengthening our foundations, but also moving as fast as the world expects us to move today?
Fair enough. I mean, okay, so the advice I gave you was heavily conditioned on sort of a graduate path, right? Like if you want to go towards a PhD and be a researcher, right? That's different if you want to be like in the industry and you want a job outside of your undergraduate degree. So then I agree that it's important to be relevant and have basically skills in your toolbox that address the market. The point is that like early on, I think it's important to not, a lot of time I see students kind of try to rush through these parts, right? Like not give them, and by these parts, I mean sort of fundamental disciplines. My point is not necessarily to focus on them more than sort of your specialty that's dictated by reality, as you just mentioned, but to not brush them aside, right? And I think it's important because you'll have pressure from internships, from the market, from whatever, to put all of your eggs into learning the latest, coding environment or whatever. And you'll have less pressure to spend on, learning statistical physics or mean field theory or whatever, right? But that's what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to like remind you that this is important and you need to put pressure on this, even if the reward and the reward signals aren't as immediate as the other ones. That to be said, I'm not saying like just do math and physics, right? Like it's important, as you say, to have like a pragmatic balance of things. But I'm reminding you that it's going to pay, like if you truly understand these types of key results that come into these research papers that you read, that's how you're going to get ahead.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think that's great advice, Professor. Thank you.
Yeah, for me, that was awesome to hear. I think I'll try and take that to heart. Do a bit more. I'm doing like math and computer science, but
there you go. Again,
but,
this I'm preaching to the choir here, I guess. But yeah.
And sort of
biased, of course.
Yeah. And so sort of the initial statement was like do more math, and yeah, awesome, build the fundamentals. Do you have like a position on the balance between applied math and more pure math inside of there, or both are important to fundamentals, or?
Yeah, both are important. I mean, applied math is kind of a weird beast because you essentially take mathematics and like you tailor them to problems. So it's just math, right? Like just, of course, at some point there's a lot of quirky questions about how the universe works, such that pure mathematics goes pretty deep into questions that you might not need all the details that come out of these questions, right? But the basics, know the landscape is my point. So
awesome. Know the landscape. Super cool. Well, sorry for running a little bit over here. That was super interesting.
Oh, that's fine.
Got to learn so much about your background going through academia, learning about brain-computer interfaces, what the sort of future horizon looks like, some awesome ethics and AI, and touch on a whole bunch of stuff. Awesome advice. So yeah, thanks again so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. It was lovely.
Yeah, thank you so
much,
much,
Good luck
Professor.
with all your projects.
Thank you.
All right. I gotta run. See you guys.